Neglected by the world, says Amnesty International. Human rights are in a downward spiral due to the politics of fear. But how much weight do these statements carry? And do they really ease the victims' plight? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Lauren Taylor. Human rights are in meltdown. Governments are creating an increasingly divided and dangerous world. So says Amnesty International in its annual report just out. Darfur is described as a bleeding wound on the world's conscience. The report claims that here and in other trouble spots, the international community is failing massively to stop injustice. It calls on states to invest more heavily in global law. But while few would disagree with the sentiments, do these proclamations actually do any good?
Amnesty International is the largest independent human rights organisation worldwide. Its emblem signifies light in the darkness of prisons, torture chambers and death camps around the world. The organisation has 2.2 million members, lobbying everyone from governments to political groups. Their demands? Rights for the individual.
Kneel down!
A recent example of this was in January this year, when protesters stood outside US embassies, calling for the closure of Guantanamo Bay. As well as taking direct action, Amnesty International also looks into human rights abuses and discloses who those abusers are.
In 2006, Iran, Iraq, Sudan, Pakistan, the United States and China were responsible for over 90% of the executions.
We felt also that it was important to be in Cairo.
The organisation does not accept funds from governments. Instead, it relies on its own fundraising efforts. And this year, Amnesty International celebrates its 48th year fighting for human rights.
Hugo McPherson reporting there. But Amnesty International isn't the only charitable organisation campaigning worldwide. Human Rights Watch, like Amnesty, raises awareness about human rights abuses, enlisting the public and the international community to support the cause of human rights for all. Environmental issues are championed by organisations such as Greenpeace, which campaigns on everything from nuclear disarmament to the protection of wildlife. While Oxfam campaigns on many fronts, it's most famous for its work to overcome poverty and suffering, particularly among children in the poorest parts of Africa. Well, we're joined now by our guests from London by Paul Hildur, the campaign director for global human rights website avaz.org. From Washington by Ariel Cohen, who's a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and will shortly be joined by Malcolm Smart, the director of the Middle East and North Africa programme at Amnesty International. If I could go to you first of all, Paul Hildur, do you think there are too many organisations fighting for human rights?
Far from it. I'm afraid there may not be enough. We're 100% supportive of the report that Amnesty have put out today. The only question is, when you shine a light into the dark places of the world, what can you then do about it? What are you then going to do about it? And I think one of the things that we're trying to do as a global online network of hundreds of thousands of people taking action together on urgent issues, from climate change to war in the Middle East to human rights, and Guantanamo is a particular issue for us. The question for us is, how can we be politically effective? And I imagine Amnesty would have some sympathy with that.
Ariel Cohen, do you think being politically effective, do you think these organisations are politically effective?
In many cases they are. They're forming the public agenda, but unfortunately they're deeply biased. For example, to come and complain against U.S. war on terror is ludicrous, because if U.S. will not lead the world in the world of in the war on terror, we are going to be victims of terrorism, just like those 55 Londoners, 200 Madridians, and 3,000 New Yorkers were, and numerous hundreds and thousands of people in the Middle East. We need leadership in the Western world to fight terrorism.
Paul Hildur, that argument about counter-terrorism, does that make it more difficult to promote human rights in the kind of context of counter-terrorism action?
There's no question but that human rights in many circumstances have taken a bit of a beating since September the 11th, which was a terrible day for us all around the world. And there were people everywhere, including in places like Tehran, rising up and saying, we're all Americans here, you know, we really feel the pain. But unfortunately, America took a unilateral path. It took a path of war rather than a path of law. One of the things that we're trying to do, as well as Amnesty and other civil society organisations, is to propose an alternative route. Now, I think one of the problems that we've got here, one of the problems is that. Sorry,
let me just. I'm sorry, Ariel Cohen, you were trying to intervene there. What was your point?
I'm saying terrorism is not a law enforcement issue. It's not drug abuse. It's not prostitution. It's hundreds and thousands of people with arms, brainwashed by the most radical mullahs around the world and by others, financed, and it's a global threat, not just to America, not just to Britain, but to the Middle East and to the Ummah at the first priority. And you cannot just treat it as something for police or law enforcement.
But the part
just
of
the tools are wrong.
Would you say? But part of the problem is that human rights activists are saying that too many people have gone too far in trying in actually taking away people's actual rights in this fight against terrorism.
I sat through presentations by Ms. Irene Khan, the Secretary General of Amnesty International, and she has no understanding to speak of what terrorist threat is. She is focused on particular legal issues which may or may not be of value, but you have to have a broader policy approach to what the real threat is. And to talk about the fear-mongering by Western governments, again, it's ludicrous because we're dealing with hundreds and thousands of people all over the world in a vast movement that advocates killing innocent civilians.
Okay,
let's not forget that.
Let's just return, though, to the whole issue of campaigning through these organisations. Paul Hildur, you're using the internet as a kind of a new mechanism. What can you do with the internet that hasn't been done in the past through the kind of campaigning that we've seen, the traditional campaigning?
Well, we now have 1 billion people around the world who can use the internet. We have 2 billion people who can use mobile phones. Those figures are growing very, very rapidly. And those networks give us the opportunity for millions and potentially hundreds of millions of people to act together at the same time or in close coordination to raise their voices together on things that they care about. Ariel Cohen, I think, was questioning the legitimacy of civil society organisations and NGOs to campaign on these kinds of issues, and I'm afraid he's out of touch with legitimacy in his own country. The Congress, which was elected at the end of 2006, is really not in step with this ideology or this story of the war on terror. They're developing bills to close down Guantanamo and to bring a proper legal process to bear on those cases. They're changing their attitude on Iraq. I think there are questions about how the world together can take a responsible approach on Iraq, and that's one of the things I say about political action, that it's not enough simply to point to individuals. We need to look at the systemic solutions to some of these problems. But I think the tide is turning here.
If I could bring you back in, Ariel Cohen, on that point on Guantanamo Bay, it seems that in some cases... In some cases, these organisations are making some headway and convincing the governments that they need to do something about it.
Right. Well, first of all, I think it is really a low blow to falsify my statement and to say that I question the legitimacy of civil society. I said no such thing whatsoever. As for Guantanamo, we have now a track record of several years that people who are released from Guantanamo go back and engage in terrorism. And these people have to be kept off the streets by legal means, but also by strict enforcement. And unfortunately, I'm very sorry to hear that the so-called advocates of human rights now are obsessed with what the United States is doing and are not paying attention to what Iran is doing. Not Amnesty International. Amnesty mentioned Iran, mentioned Sudan, and more power to it for that. But there is an extremist position on the left and in the extremist parts of the European left that sees America as a villain,
Okay, let me just stop you briefly. We've finally got Malcolm Smart from Amnesty. We had a slight technical problem there. Thank you very much for joining us. You've been attacked for bias on this programme so far. How do you defend Amnesty from the kind of attacks that we've been hearing?
Well, we're not biased. We use objective standards to assess human rights developments around the world, to report on abuses of human rights so far as we can find out about them, to draw attention to them. We're an organization that works to promote and protect human rights. So we describe it as we see it. We do that on a consistent approach. We're not partisan. We're not of the left, we're not of the right. We're trying to do this objectively, consistently across countries. And I reject the criticism that we are one-sided and that we're getting things wrong. I think time and time again we've been proved to be absolutely on the mark, and we will continue to be. So
in places where it is difficult to report, how do you go about getting the information?
Well, quite clearly, you know, it's very difficult in some circumstances. Iraq, for the moment, because of the security issue, for example, very difficult to obtain information about who's doing what, who's responsible for which sectarian killings, to get that level of detail. We try to do it. We try to do it through developing as wide a range of sources as we can, of trying to get witness information from. Of course, there may be people with political agendas, but we look carefully at that. We've established our authority over more than 40 years of being painstaking in trying to get our research right, trying to get corroboration. Of course, we face major difficulties in some countries, and that's reflected in our inability to report as fully on some countries. North Korea would often be mentioned. It's a very difficult country to penetrate. That doesn't mean to say we don't make as many efforts as we can, and it's also not a reason why we should you know, self-censor and not point to problems in other countries where we can bring the information out. We can say what's wrong, we can say who's doing wrong and what should be done about it.
I think Amnesty is totally missing the point, because the threat today is from the jihadi organizations that have no respect for human rights whatsoever, that decapitate people, that kidnap people, that kill innocent men, women, and children through suicide bombing. The threat is not from democratic states in the United States or in Europe.
Right. Well, gentlemen, clearly a heated debate. Let me keep you all there for the moment. We're going to take a very short break now. When we come back, we'll be discussing the successes and failures of the human rights groups. Do stay with us.